Right, so that now means the last item left on the agenda is item 7, which is the short-term accommodation district plan change recommendation. I'll ask Alison and Mark to come back up to the table so we can start. Is there anything you want to add before we start questions?
Happy to start with the questions.
Okay. I'll quickly add then, because obviously I assume all the councillors have received a lot of emails over the course of the last couple of days, plus we've obviously heard a lot of deputations as well, and it just appears that through some of the deputations and emails there may be a slight amount of confusion about actually the process that we're following and actually some of the recommendations within this plan change. This is actually quite a long process that started a while back and has reached obviously the point it is now. The decision we are making today is to decide whether as a council we notify this plan change to the district plan, which also will require more public consultation, which will allow everyone to have another chance to have their say to a hearings panel that would actually make that recommendation back to council. So it's quite a rigorous process, and it's actually going through submissions. So it's actually going through quite a rigorous process before it even comes to a final decision, which is still some way off. And I think what may be missing somewhere is actually currently the district plan actually makes unhosted home accommodation a discretionary activity, which means that actually at the moment already require a resource consent. Also, the hosted accommodation, apart from some minor rule changes, which obviously we've heard from the deputations about their concern of that, is actually staying the same as a permitted activity. So it just seems that I think some people may not be quite understanding the detail of actually what we're proposing to change. And from what I've seen, there's two distinct stakeholder groups, and one believes we've gone too far, the other believes we haven't gone far enough. And potentially that means we're striking the right balance between both groups, because it's going to be very hard to actually please everyone. But on that note, I just want to open it up to questions. Andrew?
Thank you. I've got two questions and they both relate to the same matter. So settlements on Banks Peninsula are clearly going to be affected by these changes. I'm keen to know which settlements will be affected and which settlements won't. So the proposal as it currently stands presumably includes clearly residential areas such as Littleton, Diamond Harbour, Little River. It also includes Akaroa, where there have been many holiday homes established for many, many years. So the question is to check that it includes all of those areas, but also will some of the bays where much development has been specifically holiday homes, places like Little Akaloa, Wainui, French Farm, and Rapaki was also mentioned in one of the submissions, will those areas also be included?
So within the settlements in Banks Peninsula and sort of the Akaroa town centre and the residential areas around that, those are zoned as a residential zone. So they would still require controlled activity resource consent for the first 60 days, but the rural areas outside of the centres would have the rural rules. So it would be permitted for the first 180 days.
So what are we calling the centres and what are we calling the rural areas? So, you know, Little Akaloa, for example, is there residential there and is that rural? Wainui, for example, is that residential or is it rural? Little River, what of that is considered residential and what's considered rural?
We might just be able to pull the map.
So the zone in question that, so the majority of Banks Peninsula is zoned as rural. There is what's called a residential small settlement zone that applies to some of the settlements on Banks Peninsula, including Akaroa, Littleton, Little River. I'll just need to refer to, for a complete list, all of those. The balance are zoned rural, so it won't be a moment.
Right, thank you.
Nice music playing in the background. How long is it going to take to find the information you're looking for?
If we can come back to that in a moment.
You've got another question? Then?
Yeah, I've got another question. That'll need to be answered before we come into debate, obviously. But yeah, I apologise for not putting the question through earlier. So, depending on the answer to that question, option 3C, area-based provisions for a more enabling approach, and Banks Peninsula is one area that could be considered for that. If there was a desire to achieve a more enabling approach in that way for Banks Peninsula by way of an amendment today, what would that result in terms of process? I'm assuming that the proposal could be amended and then go out for consultation with that amendment without any need for further decision making by the committee before that, as long as any amendment was clear enough?
So this, if the committee's decision is to notify the plan change, through the submissions and through the hearings process, there's an opportunity to look at the arguments for amending the district plan, including potentially a different approach on Banks Peninsula. I'm sorry to interrupt. You're answering the question differently than it was put. If there was a desire to amend the proposal today, so amending the proposal before it goes out for consultation, I appreciate there's a process for picking up feedback during consultation process that may result in change. But from a point of view of, from my point of view, if I was wanting to see something different than we're going out with in the agenda that's put in front of us today, if I was keen to see a change to the proposal before it went out, is it as simple as getting an amendment carried today which is clear enough to be able to be implemented and a change to the proposal be made, and then can we go out and consult without a need to bring the amended version back to the committee for further approval?
So a resolution could be made today of a change to what is before you. That would require a subsequent review of the evaluation that accompanies the plan change. So it would be both changes to the package of rules that are before you and review and changes to the Section 32 report, which is the assessment of options and benefits and costs of those, and whether which option best achieve the purpose of the RMA. That would take some time, so it would delay notification, but to answer your question, a resolution could be made today to reflect that change if it was so desired.
Thank you.
Aaron.
Yeah, so my questions around the points that have been raised by a number of submitters today, not for the hosted, but the non-hosted, and the even getting to an even playing field around health and safety and rating. Going through this entire process, how does that get us to that eventual outcome?
So there's a number of different things that the council can look at in order to...
Through this process?
Well, so the district plan is...
separate to?
Yeah, the district plan is a separate process.
Yeah.
So there's also the requirements from the Building Act, which sit at the national level, and those are primarily the requirements around health and safety and access for disabled persons. And there's also, rates is also a separate process. So like I said, the council can consider that through the long-term plan process and through the rating policy. So this is only one component of it, which is the rules in the district plan around what requires a resource consent or doesn't require a resource consent in different parts of the district. And there's an opportunity through those other processes to look at whether or not there's other opportunities to level the playing field. In terms of the district plan, we can't consider trade competition. So the justification for the district plan rules isn't around leveling the playing field, it's around looking at what are the environmental effects of these different types of activities, and what are the types of activities where we need to have a closer look to make sure that they're being managed, to manage the impacts on neighbours and on the wider community.
So by and large, the majority of issues that were raised today are not addressed in this process at all, are they?
I think the issues around where's the appropriate point to require a resource consent is relevant to the decision that the council is making today. Some of the questions around the health and safety issues and the rates issues are managed through different processes.
Right, so I recently read a contract for buying a property in Lakes District, Wanaka, not Queenstown, but still same rules I'm assuming, and you had to pay commercial rates because it was for short term, you could use it yourself, but so on and so forth, had a whole lot of health and safety. So why are they there and we're not?
So there's a separate process for the council to consider how it applies residential rates through the long-term plan and through the rating policy. Well,
essentially, if you buy a unit like in Fletcher one or wherever in town, and you're going to rent it out, you're just buying a hotel room or a motel room, just one, or you might buy 5, whatever, depends on how much you've got to spend, but that's all it is. It's a hotel or a motel room. Why is that not treated as such? If you're not there, hosted aside, that's completely different.
We have some colleagues that are waiting in the other room that are looking at the rates issue, so we could ask them to come in to address that issue. But I think that the decision for the committee today is around the district plan, and there's a separate consultation process that's required to change rates.
Yeah,
so
we don't necessarily need that today, Mike, but we can address it when's appropriate. Thank you.
Melanie.
A couple of questions. First, and most of it's around the proposed control activity for the 1 to 60 nights. So first, how did you come up with this proposal for 1 to 60 instead of 1 to something else?
So we looked at a number of different scenarios, and we wanted to recognize that there's a lot of different types of visitor accommodation that's offered in residential units. So you'll have scenarios where people live in the unit and then they go away on holiday for a couple of weeks, all the way to scenarios where there isn't a full-time resident in the unit. And we were looking at what are the opportunities to enable people who do actually live there to let it out while they're away. And if you look at generally the amount of holiday time that people would usually have, the number of statutory holidays, it gets up to maybe around 60 days. We also looked at some of the restrictions on other non-residential activities in residential zones. So things like preschools and those types of activities are required to be closed on Sundays. And the purpose of that is to give some respite to the neighbors so they have some assurance that it's not going to be all weekend, every weekend. And so we looked at about 60 days as an appropriate amount to recognize that in some situations people do live there. They want some flexibility to let their house out. But we also need to look at that in terms of what we're enabling for other types of non-residential activities in those zones.
Right, thanks. And with the controlled, if someone's applying for this controlled resource consent, what exactly would be controlled? Can you sort of summarise that?
So the plan sets out the matters of control. So any conditions that were placed on the application would have to be within those matters of control. So there are things like making sure that the neighbors have contact information, that the guests have information around where they can park or can't park, that the unit's distinctive, so you don't have situations where people are knocking on all the neighbors' doors trying to find the right units. Managing outdoor recreation areas, so if they've got pools or tennis courts or outdoor stereo systems, just making sure that there's some controls around how those are being used. and just making sure that somebody's make sure the bins go out and come back in, that the landscaping's being maintained. So it's those types of things that we want to make sure are still happening when there isn't a permanent resident there.
Great, thanks. And one more, just what, in terms of someone applying for these resource consents, is there a difference in cost for applying for one that's controlled versus discretionary?
So a controlled activity consent for this type of activity would, like we said, potentially be within about 1,000 to 2,000. Discretionary and non-complying activities become more complex because there's more issues that can be looked at. And because we're also proposing policies around trying to ensure that the residential unit is still being used as a residence, which makes it more challenging to demonstrate that that's the case for those types of applications. But they can be more expensive, but they're unlikely to be more than, yeah, I think it would be like a very complex resource consent would potentially get up to 20,000, but I don't think that would be the norm for those types of activities.
Thanks, Alison.
Yeah.
Tim, nothing for you? James, Goff.
Thanks, just off mute there. A couple of questions from me. First up, look, it's proposed that the hosted accommodation is a permitted activity, but with restrictions applying on likes of arrival times, gathering numbers and so forth. How would those be enforced, and is there a cost to the applicant for that?
So there's two additional standards that are proposed for hosted accommodation. So one of them is around very late night arrivals. So people allowing check-in or check-out from the unit after 10 p.m. and before 6 a.m. And those could be enforced by generally, the issue is around people making a lot of noise as they're coming in or coming out. And if we receive complaints about that, then there would be the opportunity to investigate that. And the same with larger functions. So if there was a really large wedding reception or something that had been organized on the site, there would be the opportunity for the compliance team to assess that against the rules.
Okay, so and the second part of the question was, is there a cost to the applicant for this, or is that essentially that no consent is required and nothing more is no other cost is borne by the applicant?
If so, in terms of monitoring the consent conditions, that's cost recoverable for the council. So if the we've got someone from the compliance team who might to come in and answer.
I think you're saying what I'm saying is, if it is a permitted activity, it isn't. They don't need to require. They're not required to do anything additionally. Does the applicant need to outlay any cost to do that, or can they just simply get on with doing what they do within the guidelines the council is specifying?
So as part of the consent, in some cases there's monitoring.
In respect of a permitted activity, they can get on and.
I'm clear.
Sorry, just to repeat that, for a permitted activity, they can just get on and commence the operation.
Okay, so but then we then would place restrictions on arrival times and gathering numbers and so forth. So I guess then my question is, why can't such controls on noise and numbers and bins and everything like that be managed under existing regulations like it would for you or I?
I think there's a number of different types of sites, and there might be different ways to mitigate the effects that are different for those different sites. So in my view, I think controlled activity status is more appropriate because it provides more flexibility to come up with the best solution for that site. And given the sort of the number of impacts that were highlighted in the feedback, I think controlled activity status gives that opportunity to look at the whole package and to come up with the best solution for it.
I think the just to supplement that, the difference relative to you or I is the visitors to a site may not be familiar with requirements, and there's potentially issues arising that wouldn't otherwise arise with the permanent resident being on the same site.
Yes, but they'd get pretty familiar with it fast if they had allowed party there and noise control arrived.
Sorry, I missed the last part of what you said.
They would get a acclimatised to the rules pretty quickly, though, wouldn't they? If someone later complained to neighbour due to having a loud party and noise control arrived and seized their stereo.
Certainly the host would, but visitors to the site would, granted that once the consent's in place, it's enduring for any subsequent visitors, but unless there's the appropriate controls put in place in the first instance, then there's a risk of adverse effects arising for the first visitor and subsequent visitors.
Okay, so help me out with this one. If I can just use, like, say, a real example, which I imagine a lot of people are in. I guess I'm concerned that I don't want the unintended consequences to span too far. Totally appreciate the need to tame the Wild West in some areas, like the residential hotels, for lack of a better word. No question there. But say someone has a batch in Akaroa, to use Andrew's example there, and they rent it out a few weekends, a week or a year or something like that. So it's under that 60 days. Maybe it's 10 days a year or something. It's rented on Airbnb. Would that cost them anything? Do they have to do anything differently? Do they don't need a resource consent by the sounds of things?
So if the batch is in a rural area?
Yeah, so say Akaroa.
So if it's in a residential area in Akaroa, then they would require the controlled activity consent for the first 60 days.
Right. Okay. All right. So I guess following on from that, in the emails that a number of the elected members have got, there's been the suggestion made that what's being proposed would be potentially one of the most punitive approaches in New Zealand. Is that true? If so, why? And if not, why not?
I think it's comparable to the provisions in Queenstown. So in Queenstown, they have a high-density residential zone where it's a permitted activity, but in the rest of the residential zones, it's a controlled activity for the first 90 days. So those provisions are subject to appeal, but I think that's comparable to what's being proposed here. So.
Okay, that's right. Thanks.
Thank you. Yanni? Just 1 second.
Based on what we've heard today, are there any changes you'd recommend to the document you've got before us?
I think that there's the opportunity through the submission and hearings process to consider additional feedback and potential for changes, and that's a robust process that allows people to respond to those potential changes. So based on the deputations that I heard today, I'd still support the plan changes as it's been proposed to go forward for notification, and noting that there's still the opportunity through the hearings process to consider any issues that are raised.
So if we wanted to move an amendment, for example, around Central City to go to 3A, we could do that here and now?
I would just note to caution around it. The evaluation that has been carried out to ascertain the preferred option required some assessment of the costs and benefits of the different options, but also an assessment of consistency with higher order documents. In the context of the Central City, there's the Christchurch Central Recovery Plan that is still in play until July of next year. By that I mean we are required to be consistent with that document. If we were to propose a different approach for the Central City, we'd need to consider the extent to which it's consistent with the recovery plan, and I don't know that we could do that by way of a response on the spot.
I mean, I think based on what I've heard from staff, and given there's a huge number of questions, and the meeting was supposed to finish 4 minutes ago, it would seem to me logical to actually take time, work through what amendments we wanted to put forward, have staff advice. But I personally can't see what the point is having all these submissions today and then not be able to make changes based on what we've heard. So,
yeah, they're not submissions, they're deputations. It's totally different. We'll have to see. Obviously, there's a couple of people signalling amendments, and if those amendments are supported, which we don't know yet, then obviously we'll have to work out the consequence of that. So we won't be able to make a decision on this report today. So
we're not even in a position to move.
well, actually, I will be happy to move this as it stands, and then we can see if there's amendments. But have you got any other questions?
Well, sorry, I just want to be clear then. If I move the Central City amendment to 3A, is that a possible amendment that I can move today based on what I've just heard from Council staff?
If you choose to move the amendment and it's supported, then we'll have to then it'll have to go into their substantive. But we won't be able to make a final decision today until we actually have more information on actually the effect of that decision, and it'll have to come back to the committee for a final decision.
Also, if I can add, option 3A is an area-specific approach. It's not the detail of, it doesn't specify what the rules would be for an area-specific approach, recognising that it's bespoke to an area. If we were to put forward an alternative of 3A for the Central City, we would really need to work through what is the appropriate threshold, what are the appropriate standards that would be put in place of what we're proposing. Also, just a note of caution that if we're proposing an approach for the Central City, it does there's a risk that you're subject to whether it's more restrictive or permissive, saying that the effects of this activity in the Central City are different to effects in a suburban context. So if I can use an example of that, a multi-unit complex in a Central City context, the effects are potentially no different of that compared with a multi-unit complex in a suburb of Christchurch. And if you were to propose a different approach for the Central City, then you would need to justify that the effects are different and warrants a different approach to manage those effects compared to what might be a similar development in a suburban context. That's right.
Yeah. And just a final question, in terms of the issue of central government, like aside from the National Register, is there any sort of progress on what they're doing? It does seem to me a bit kind of bizarre that locally we're going to spend a whole bunch of time and energy and resources on something that is actually a national and possibly an international issue, but certainly a national issue. So is there anything else happening other than a national register by central government?
We know that there's a working group that's been formed by MB to look at a range of issues, but we don't have any clarity at this point around if that's strictly looking at the registration issue, which is different to district plan rules. So the benefits of registration is around the ease of enforcing the rules. Generally, each council still determines its own land use unless there's been a national direction. So we haven't had any indication that a national direction is likely to be forthcoming in the short to medium term, which is why we're recommending that the proposed plan change.
And just, I guess, just one final question. It's just the 12 properties in Sumner. Are we aware of it, and have we taken enforcement on it? I mean, it does seem quite incredible.
I don't think that's relevant to the decision we're making right now. Is there any other questions? Sarah, did you have a question?
Just a process question. If people are putting forward amendments or different options, I mean, an amendment's one thing, but putting up a different option is probably a foreshadowed motion. But if we were trying to do that today, and things just went through today, does that put us at any legal risk for process? Because I know that there's very strong views with probably lots of lawyers on both sides. I think there's three kind of clear parties. There's the residents, the hosts, and then the sort of the hospitality.
Yeah, I've already stated that actually if someone puts an amendment, we're not going to carry anything as a substantive that's going to actually change what we currently have, and it'll have to come back.
Follow-up was how much more time does that take for us to go through a whole new process to get to here? To bring a new paper back with the new amendment with the new bits and pieces.
The task of putting forward a different proposal or preferred option would require justification through the Section 32 report. To present a Section 32 report that supports any revised preferred option requires some evidence and would require consideration of that revised preferred option against higher order documents and what the effects are. So it's not it depends on the degree of change, of course. If it's minor, then it's a shorter exercise, but if it's more substantial, then it's several weeks.
But the thing is, we've got a Section 32A report here, which backs up the preferred option, and it's not likely we would end up with a different outcome if we went through the same process again. Because it's been clear and there's been lots of evidence and lots of engagement already.
That's right. So
yeah.
Would have to have some new information to justify a different approach.
Yeah.
Okay. Jay?
Yeah, just a question of you, Mr. Chair. So are you saying that if we propose amendments, you won't deal with the substantive today, or if amendments are supported? Because
the first decision I'm going to make is whether actually the amendment is in order. If it is in order and it does carry, we're not going to be able to pass this whole thing today because we actually need to know the impact of that, and which will take a lot of time.
which would bring it back into order, I would have thought.
So if there are, I've moved this as Councillor Templeton seconded it.
Right. Well.
Can I get that?
Yeah. So Andrew's still waiting for the answer to his very first question.
And I have an answer. The residential small settlement affects a number of settlements on Banks Peninsula. I'll briefly give you some examples. Takamatua, Barry's Bay, Tekau Bay, Birdlings Flat, Pigeon Bay, Pureale, Governor's Bay, Cass Bay, Littleton, Akaroa, Rapaki. Outside the larger settlements of Littleton and Akaroa, the areas that are zoned as residential are relatively small. So taking Takamatua as an example, it is those properties that are residential and more residential in nature, rather than extending into what are larger properties.
So Little Akaloa, for example, which is almost
Akaroa.
entirely made up of batches.
Little Akaroa, there is part of it is zoned residential small settlement.
So would be covered by these provisions.
That's right.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you.
For completeness, I've emailed that list through.
Thank you.
Oh, you still going?
You're right, James.
Okay. Can you just confirm what you said? I missed. Me? I missed what you said about 2 o'clock tomorrow.
Okay. We're going to finish at 1:30 today. Hopefully I'm going to get through all the questions so we actually know where we're at, and then we'll adjourn it, and then we'll recommence the meeting at 2 p.m. tomorrow. Yeah. Jimmy?
Okay, thank you, Chair. Quickly ask, because particular 5.1, the staff report emphasized public engagement already done, and 570 the kind of response received. So, but that's before the lockdown of the COVID-19, am I right? Mm-hmm. But now we public notification for all those proposed different plan change 4. I just want to know the process exactly the same or still different, because now we process this plan review. There's a hearing panel, then make a decision, then open public make a submission. Am I right?
Yes, that's right.
So that's a total difference from before, prior to the lockdown.
Yeah, so the process that we undertook before the lockdown was an informal engagement process to get the views of the community on some broad policy directions that we could be moving in. Yes. What we have now is a specific proposal, which we're proposing for notification, and that goes into a more formal process where there's an opportunity for people to put in submissions and attend a hearing. So it's a little bit of a different process. But
thank you.
Before you ask your question, Andrew, I'm just going to slightly change how I was going to actually run these amendments. I'm not going to make them as amendments. They're actually direct negatives to what we're actually putting forward, which is the staff's preferred option. So I'm going to treat them as foreshadowed motions, and therefore we'll be moving the actual resolutions in front of us that I've moved first, and then if they fail, then we'll look at the 2 foreshadowed motions if they do come. Looking at the time in front of us now, I don't want to start the debate today. We'll start the debate tomorrow at 2 p.m. So that will actually give the time for Andrew and Yanni, if you're going to put forward a foreshadowed motion, to actually write that up. So do you have any questions?
Well, I mean, my amendment is that the proposal be amended. So I question why that wouldn't be an amendment. Because, you know, I may or may not be comfortable with what's in front of us, depending on how or whether it's amended.
Yeah. So the question is, and in front of us at the moment, there's two things we're making a decision on. One is whether we notify the plan change, which I don't think's in question with what you want to go with your amendment. The other one is actually if we're going to agree to the preferred recommendation from the officers. What you're saying is you don't actually agree with that, you want to put something different in front of us. To me, that is a direct negative. So therefore, I'm treating it as a foreshadowed motion. That's my answer to that. Do you have any questions, though, further before we adjourn the meeting?
Can we get some advice on that? I mean, I certainly aren't wanting to undermine you, but
we obviously have 25 hours before we pre-adjourn, so we'll get some advice. Are there any more questions? Leanne?
I want people to be, because I mean the RMA process is not a straightforward process. So I guess my question is, for clarification, if the councillors had an opinion that we wanted to do something to our district plan and notify it, could you create a Section 32 report to support it if there wasn't the evidence to back it up?
We couldn't prepare a Section 32 report that didn't support the direction that we were recommending, but there would be the need for.
In the Section 32 report, evidence is a key component, as is consideration of whether the preferred option achieves higher order direction from national and regional planning documents. There's also a consideration of its the extent to which the preferred option achieves the purpose of the Act. Without justification, we wouldn't be able to put forward a Section 32 report.
Yeah, I mean that's the thing that bothers me is that, that we can end up debating issues that without understanding the structure of what is a very, very legalistic process, and these things are often of necessity. They have to meet the requirements of the Act in order for the district plan change to actually occur.
That's right. And we are going into a process where, whilst what we are seeking to have approval of is to be notified, it's through this process there'll be submissions that seek changes, no doubt, and what comes back to the council for approval of is ultimately the important point in this process. What you're dealing with is essentially a proposal to notify. This is going to come back to you in a revised form, no doubt, which is recommendations of a commissioner, and then council will be considering a different plan change before it, which reflects the recommendations, and there'll be an opportunity to consider what it is then, and I'd have no doubt that it's potentially different to what we're notifying now. So council can seek to make amendments that it wishes to the plan change, assuming there is justification for it, that we can have a Section 32, but with any process under the RMA, there's a likelihood of changes being made after even any amendments are made today. So the submissions process is still available.
And if the council makes a decision then to adjust the actual amendment to the district plan, it can be appealed by anyone who's submitted on it, is that right?
That's right, yes. So even if council approves the recommendations of the commissioners or the hearings panel to what's been sought through submissions, there's a right of appeal beyond that. So that's where ultimately the courts will determine the appropriate outcome, and whilst after appeals it comes back to council, there's very limited grounds for council to depart from what the court will decide.
Yep. Thank you.
Are these questions of This is question time?
Yep.
Is it? Okay. Are you as chair aware that I'm disappointed that I'm not going to be able to attend tomorrow? Because I understand why you're doing this, but you know, it's an important issue, but I cannot attend because I'll be going into hospital tomorrow afternoon after falling from my bike. So, having an operation. So, I won't be here, and I'm really disappointed about that, but I do understand the circumstances. Are you aware of that?
No, I was not aware of that because obviously originally we were hoping to have this concluded today, and so we've taken up time at the council meeting to finish it off. So apologies that you can't make it tomorrow.
Oh, right. Okay.
Is there any more questions on the item in front of us? Otherwise, I'm going to move to adjourn, to lay this on the table until we adjourn the meeting. And reconvene tomorrow in the council chamber at. Oh.
Wait. What time would the community boards be going to? I've got to hear the community boards. That's why.
Yeah. It's actually on there for conclusion, but.
What time do they come? No. But say. Can we adjourn to 11:30, for example? Is that safe?
So,
or they say on time, what would they say? 11:30 is an hour and a half, no?
For tomorrow.
Oh, for you, for your community board chairs.
No, for yours. If you could adjourn to 11:30 tomorrow.
Yeah. Well, it's how it
And then you
affects
would adjourn
Yep.
council until after the end of this. All right, so we do it in the middle.
Yep.
James can be here for
Okay.
this.
Yep.
Okay.
Yep.
The other stuff, which is really exciting.
Okay.
I'm just trying to be helpful.
Yep.
I wasn't being grumpy either.
Sounded grumpy, James.
Oh, I was phrasing it as a question. Are you aware?
I'm helping you.
Okay, do I have someone to second that? Tim? All those in favour? Anyone opposed? Carried. So the meeting's adjourned till 11:30 tomorrow, where we'll finish this item.